introductions right now. So let's pass it to Alex.
All right. Hi there. I am the representative today for the Old North End Mutual Aid. My name is Alex Sigrist. I use they or he pronouns. Either one's fine. I guess I'll talk a little bit about what Old North End Mutual Aid is, since I'm representing an organization and not myself here. We're a group that was established in March of last year, in the wake of COVID really, first being a real problem and creating a lot of new problems for people in our community. And it was formed primarily to address the material needs of people in the neighborhood first, but then as we've kind of gone in surrounding areas as well, making sure that we don't have community members falling through the cracks. And as we've kind of moved beyond crisis response, we're really have leaned into focusing on mutual aid as an actual political practice, as a theory of social organization. And so mutual aid is really just a system of practice that's rooted in community, where community members provide for the needs of one another cooperatively, in solidarity with one another. And this project then of our organization is developing this system of our community by recreating or creating for the first time community connections via reciprocal sharing of things that we have that others need. And so a large part of this is really just kind of working against the trend of a really atomized society where we kind of leave individuals to fend for themselves, where the existence of kind of a community identity has maybe been lessened or devalued, where people don't really know their neighbors or what struggles their neighbors have. And mutual aid as a political project is fundamentally anti-capitalist. We're positioned in a place where we envision a different kind of society in terms of how and why we produce things, towards what ends, and what things really matter in, the economic reality of our society. And so the goal is that we're creating something that's not a system of exchange. There's no measuring what someone gets from the group or what people give. There's no expectation of being able to maximize how much you get out of the group. We're not competing to be the biggest winner of winning mutual aid. The goal is really simply just to restitch together a real community and create relationships that make sure that there isn't such a thing as falling through the cracks, and really allowing people to thrive no matter what their circumstances are. And I wrote just a little bit more, I guess, because being an organization, we had a little bit of a different thing. So I guess I'll just talk about a little bit about what we do day to day and what that looks like as an organization. Right now, we have 7 organizers that oversee fielding requests from the community directly. They reach out to us directly, either via text or email, or we have a Google form right now that's kind of our main way of getting info from people on what they need. And then our work is really just to make sure that we can communicate these needs to as many people as we can, that are wanting to both, develop our community, a neighborhood, city, the whole county, the rest of the state, and then also want to make sure that they're taking care of their neighbors. And so this is really just kind of an important piece of work that, we saw with the start of the pandemic. There were people that had great needs, and the real obstacle in the way is that even if there are well-meaning people that have the ability to help, it's just not simple to figure out how to, meet these things together, meet people that have things to people that need them. And so our work is really just, matching things up right now. And we're currently kind of in a long transitionary process where we're moving from more crisis response, which was, how this kind of started with COVID, to one that really fully embodies the values of mutual aid, where giving and receiving is completely reciprocal. Someone that has things like that is well off, has plenty of money, should just as easily feel like they can request things from the community, things they need done. And I feel like we've started to see that already. Actually, my introduction to the group before I came on as an organizer, I had my back windshield smashed out, and it was just an expense that was not at a good time. And I reached out to Old North End Mutual Aid and got a little help with it, way more than I could have imagined for something that seems like a small group. And now I'm giving back by doing organizational work to make sure that all this keeps flowing. But we're looking to make this, something that is just an organic, continuous community of people that take care of one another, and we're just kind of bridging that gap right now as organizers, and the hope is that we build this to a place where it doesn't need to be managed actively, and that people have systems in place of all kinds of varieties that allow them to meet the needs of people in their community, with the understanding that if they have needs too, that they're going to be met by this community that they've built.
Great, thank you. So let's go to Mr. Cina, and just give a little introduction about what your name is, something that interests you in Burlington policy, and what your position is.
Hi, my name's Brian Cina. I don't know if this is working or not. I'm not very familiar with Teams. Is it working? Like, can you see me and stuff? All right.
Yes, we can see you.
Is the lighting okay? So I do have the ring light on because it's so dark without it. So my name's Brian Cina. It's okay if you say Cina, but my name's Brian Cina. I'm a state representative. I live in the Old North End. The district that I represent is Chittenden 6-4. So it's a small piece of the Old North End, and then most of the East District, including like the center of UVM and the hospital and East Ave and Centennial Field. I don't remember the other things you asked me to say, but I do have the list that you sent us earlier. So who do I represent? I told you. What do I do? So I'm a clinical social worker. That's like my main job. So I have a private practice in Burlington. I'm also a part-time crisis clinician at the Howard Center. And I'm a DJ and a performance artist and a state representative. Those are my 4 paid jobs. And I'm also an organizer. Maybe one thing that I would want to talk about for a minute is good Isham Street gardening and other optimistic doings. So I've lived on Isham Street since, I'm going to date myself, but since 1999. And maybe like in 2005 or so, we started this organization where we plant gardens on the street and do fun things for each other to try to just make the street happier and like create a sense of community on our block. And over the years, it really has made a difference. And a few years ago, the city realized that the crime rates on Isham Street were dramatically lower, like 30 to 60% lower across the board compared to all the surrounding streets. So it was like this one island of like crime dropping, and they were trying to figure out what it was. And the police actually recognized that it was our gardening project. It was the only thing they could identify that was like different. And so the police actually tried partnering with us to apply for a public safety grant where we were going to create community gardens all throughout the city and try to like spread this to all these different blocks. But we didn't get the grant. And then the city didn't really follow through with us after that. So I'm just putting it out there because as we look at reforming public safety, I think that the answer is mutual aid. And I see Is Good as a form of mutual aid because we create gardens where we can feed each other and create urban permaculture, but we also like take care of each other. Like when stuff happens on the street, people will like reach out to our neighbors, and like when there's a problem, we try to like deal with the conflict amongst ourselves. And I don't even know if people call the cops on each other that much now. That one particular neighbor who called the cops constantly left. So I'm just sharing that as something exciting to me. That's sort of like the intersection of all the different pieces of my life, because it's my street where I live, so it's my neighbors, but it also is an example of mutual aid, and it's an example of how we can actually change policy on public safety. So that would be the one thing I would highlight, and then we'll see what other questions come my way.
Great, thank you. Let's go to you, Ms. Paul.
So thanks. I'm a little bit in a unfortunately, as I had mentioned to Jack when this was being organized, I actually need to leave at 5:30. So I apologize for cutting this short. So my name is Karen Paul. I'm a city councilor in Ward 6, which is now, as of 5 years ago, when we did redistricting, Ward 6 is the other side of Main Street, from the UVM Green going towards, going towards the Redstone campus. It does not include the Redstone campus, but includes most of the residential areas from South Prospect Street to Main Street, and then going down towards downtown Shelburne Road. And the other border, of course, is South Burlington. So when I first got elected, so that's what I represent. And then as far as what I do, I'm a CPA. I work for an accounting firm. When I first got elected, unbeknownst to me, found myself about 9 months after I was elected in the middle of perhaps one of the financial biggest financial challenge we've had in the city over Burlington Telecom, and that pretty much took up a significant amount of time. Was really the focus in terms of having to address $17 million that had been inappropriately taken from one place and put into another. Given my financial background, that was something that obviously took up a lot of my time. But one of the first things that I actually did when I got elected was getting involved in a community garden that was done in the Old North End. That was a pocket garden. There weren't a lot of people that really wanted to deal with it. It was a pretty difficult issue to get this done. But, when you first get elected, you think that nothing is not doable. And so you are the go-to person when everybody tells you how hard something is. And you don't know how hard it is, so you do it. The same thing happened with on South Willard Street. South Willard Street is Route 7, which is a truck route. And so massive trucks were barreling across South Willard and into North Willard because they were able to. And the only way that we could get them off South Willard was an act of Congress that would change the truck weights on the interstate. And everybody told me, that's such a waste of time. You're never going to be able to do it. Move on to something else. Again, first year city councilor. Yeah, sure. Why not? And we do have a change in the truck weights, and we no longer have trucks barreling through the city. So those were a couple of the things that I had gotten involved with. And then I think one thing that I am most happy with in terms of an outcome was trying to figure out a way that people can live in safer housing and to raise the bar in terms of minimum housing. it came as a result of, quite honestly, of looking in the newspaper and seeing the way that we rate restaurants according to health code. And there's like a list of, they don't put it in the paper anymore, but they listed like, 50 different things that you had to check off in order to be a safe restaurant. And I thought, why can't we do that with housing? So that morphed into a change called the 5-star rating for certificates of compliance. We are in the midst of now changing that and raising the bar yet again. For those of you who rent off campus, you're familiar probably with the names in this town of the less than stellar landlords. And this is a way of us being able to go after them a little bit with a little bit more firepower, given the fact that we have a standardized system. So nothing happens overnight, but it certainly is something that I've been, one of the things that I've been most proud of in my time as a counselor. So I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you. So now we're gonna go and talk about a little bit about social justice. So what are some of the challenges that you have faced when trying to implement the social and racial justice policies which you support? And if you want to talk about this first, Ms. Paul, you should go ahead before you have to hop off.
Well, I think, I think all of us on the council, the three of us, by the way, hi, Max, Sarah. I think it's just the three of us. We all did support the racial justice resolution that was brought forward this past summer. And I think I did not write it, so I didn't have anything to do with the with the drafting of it. So I'm not sure that I can speak directly to that. But as far as what are the impediments, I think the impediments are, and I'll just speak for myself, is that Ward 6 is a fairly, with the exception of the people who rent in Ward 6, of which there are a significant number, particularly students who live near Champlain, because Ward 6 has the entire Champlain campus. The residents who live in Ward 6, although the demographic is changing, a lot of them are, longer-term residents, and perhaps a little bit more reluctant to change. And this is a significant change. This is really taking a look at where we are, at who is safe, who isn't safe, who is struggling to be heard, and for us to make sure that those voices are heard. And unfortunately, there are people who see this as a zero-sum game. In other words, if somebody is, for everyone who wins, there is a loser. And that's not the case with this. But that is a point of educating people to understand that just because someone else wins means that we all win in the end. And I think that's probably been the greatest struggle that I've had, is just basically trying to educate people and get them to understand that, the status quo may work for them, but it doesn't work for all.
Great, thank you. Let's see. Let's do one more response to this question before we move on to talking a little bit about the Progressive Party. So is there anyone that wants to...
from a state level, speak to this, since we have 3 city councilors and 1 state rep, and also as someone who doesn't identify as white, and I'm part of the Racial Justice Alliance steering committee, and I'm on the policy committee, and I'm on the wellness committee. And the Racial Justice Alliance has really driven these changes that you see on the city level by organizing people, turning people out to meetings, working with city councilors on policy, working with the city on implementing the policy. And so we shifted our focus at the end of the summer and started focusing on the state level. And we came up with a really bold agenda called ACT, A-C-T. A is acknowledge historic systems of oppression. C is create new systems in the government, and T is transform existing systems. And so I'm not going to tell you every single bill we introduced because I don't want to take up a lot of space, but I would highlight a few things quickly and then share some of the challenges we're facing as we try to do this work. So for years, the Racial Justice Alliance tried, just so you know, I'm on the floor of the house at the same time right now, and they just resumed, so I'm putting my phone down because they was quiet and now I can hear them. So it's going really late today. This doesn't always happen. So I've been working with the Racial Justice Alliance for years, and we've been trying to do a lot of stuff for years. And you know, every time we try to talk about police reform in a committee meeting, they let us come in for like a half hour, and then for days the police get to come in and take up a lot of space. And so that was kind of the status quo until George Floyd was murdered by the police, and then the country blew up again. Like, you know, we've had many waves of racial uprisings, but it happened again. And so some of the things we were proposing got implemented in terms of changes to use of force policy on the state level. Going into this session, we were asking for a lot. We were asking for racism to be declared a public health emergency on the state level. We're asking for reparations for slavery. We're asking that the Constitution be amended to remove slavery because it's still in the Vermont Constitution. We're asking for investments in BIPOC land access and opportunity in BIPOC businesses. And I really should say Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, because I think sometimes the word BIPOC erases our identities. So I'll slow down and at least do that. And then looking at changes to the healthcare system, as well as public safety, and a few things that have moved. A health equity bill has moved, and it's on the floor of the Senate today. It'll be coming back to the House. And if it passes, it will create a commission made up of a mix of Black organizations representing Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning, and people with disabilities, who are the groups who face the greatest health disparities over the last few years, especially during the pandemic. And this commission will guide the creation of an Office of Health Equity and a grants program, and will advise on funding of ARPA and other COVID relief money, as well as work with the healthcare provider community to reform healthcare provider education around anti-racism, cultural competency, and cultural humility. So there's a lot there. So that's a big achievement. But in terms of challenges, although we're seeing some progress with our policies moving forward, you know, it's hard to say this, but you know, I just have to be honest with you. It feels like white people want to do the minimum possible a lot of the time to feel good, and then when it gets uncomfortable, they bounce, and like they're not there for us. And the way we've been treated in the legislature has been pretty rough in terms of the marginalized communities will be brought in for a very short amount of time, and then it's all these like white professionals coming in the rest of the time who are part of government or other organizations who are speaking. And you know, we're working through it in the legislature because we're like, the community is expressing our concern, and my colleagues are hearing it and are trying to figure out how to change the processes of the legislature, because what's becoming clear is the very way we do business normally reinforces white supremacy, because it's growing out of colonization. And like, we have to just acknowledge that it's a colonial government, and everything about it, all of the practices and procedures are growing out of that. And if we don't consciously try to do things differently, we just perpetuate oppression in different forms. And so that's been one of the challenges. So I'll stop there. There's a lot more we could talk about on that topic. And if anyone is interested in working more on those issues, you can reach out to me, and you can either work with the Racial Justice Alliance, or there's a new coalition I'm part of called Seeding Power Vermont. That's BIPOC, queer, and femme-led. And we're really looking at trying to find ways to redistribute power and to empower people all around the state, and to empower people over the decisions that affect their lives. So thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, let's pass it to Annie Stibora to talk about the Progressive Party.
Thanks, Althea. Yeah, so I think we just had a couple questions about the Progressive Party in Vermont and in Burlington, because I think it's something super unique to our area. And so I can open this up to really anybody that feels, qualified or wants to speak on it. So what is the Progressive Party, and in what ways does it differ or overlap with the Democratic Party?
So I can take that. So the Vermont Progressive Party is the most successful third party in the country in terms of amount of elected officials that have won office. Our party really got its start as a more loosely formed coalition in 1981 with Bernie Sanders' victory as mayor. So about 40 years ago, Progressive started, and that victory was really came from the coming together of a variety of different activist organizations working together, and again, that progressive coalition. That informal, not necessarily party structure was used for essentially the first 2 decades of the party. So throughout the 80s and 90s, there were progressive coalition or progressive affiliated councilors and electeds, as well as a progressive mayor. There was, after Bernie Sanders, Peter Clavell, and then Bob Kiss later on after that. And then in terms of the party itself, that formed more closely around 2000, formalizing into a party, an actual formal third party structure within the state of Vermont. In terms of policy differences, there are certainly areas where we do have some overlap with Democrats. I would say that progressives just overall tend to be more ideologically left of Democrats. And that's even more complicated by some of the more the differences that you see within like the Burlingtonian context, where Burlington has been kind of a stronghold, and you see that there's even a kind of a granularity to it in the sense that you'll see differences between city Democrats and state Democrats, and then not necessarily as much between city progressives and state progressives, but you do just see a lot of that culture building up. And Burlington has historically been our stronghold, though we have elected officials from around the state in different areas. In terms of some policy specifics, one area that we focus on in terms of campaigning is that we don't take any corporate money. So no corporate donations are accepted by progressives, either the party or progressive party candidates. One of the issues, at least at the statewide level, that's been pretty defining has been advocacy around a single payer or universal healthcare system. But then, I think if you kind of like look at just the issues and kind of go down the issues, it would probably be fair to say that we're pretty uniformly left of the Democratic Party on pretty much on most issues. I don't know, Brian, if you have a different perspective, but and I don't know if the Democrats, if Sarah, you have a perspective. Yeah, I'm sure you all have a perspective on it, but that's kind of how I see it in some ways. I don't want, yeah.
Well, one of my observations, and I was not a party person at all until I had to run and sort of pick, and sort of setting aside philosophically, I have a lot of issues with parties in general. I see policy and politics as a continuum, and I get frustrated when people get put in boxes. There's a progressive party, but there's progressive ideas. My framework had always been more at the state level, where a lot of ideas like universal health care have been promoted by Democrats. So bringing it down to the city level has been an interesting process for me, because it's different than the framework that I worked at both in the state and federal level, where you have had, within parties, the left, I'm a left Democrat leading on lots of things. We have obviously Bernie Sanders running as a Democrat. So it's the context between Burlington and to some degrees the state and federal is very different to articulate. I think for those of you, and we could spend all kind of hours talking about the history of how we got where we are. I mean, I would argue that it was in fact the Democrats who screwed up in the 80s by not owning their own ideals, and sort of, for lack of a better word, forced a third party, because the Democrats, in my opinion, at that time, weren't living up to their own ideals. I think if you look at the ideals of a lot of us, they are very, very similar. It's, how do you kind of put them in practice? And I think that's just an important thing to remember. A comment I was going to make when Brian was talking about is it's really heartening, because there's a lot of activity at the state level, and this is a more global comment, but I think it's important for UVM students and all to also understand state politics. Burlington is not an island. We've really got to work together, and if we don't get state leadership supporting the things that we want to get done, it's very hard to get them done. So again, I think we need to look at our ideals and our programs and work hard to support them, be it environment or healthcare or any of the others, and try not to put us in too many boxes, but work together. And certainly Brian's been doing that at the state level with actually other of our legislators from the region and other parts of the state. So that's important.
Can I speak to the difference on the state level? Because it is kind of different. I won't take too long, but it's interesting moving between Burlington and the state level with the Democrat and progressive dynamic, because it does feel very much, and this is like, Sarah, I'm not saying you're like a Republican, but there's Democrats in Burlington and on the state level, who are more Republican to me than Democrat, but they call themselves Democrat. And in terms of their policies and like their fiscal conservatism and even their social conservatism, and so it's interesting, because on the state level, the Democratic Party wants to be this one big tent, and there's like Democrats who are also progressive endorsed on one end, but on the other end, they're like Democrats who are Republican endorsed, and there's a lot of tension in that caucus. Whereas the progressive caucus, like I'm a PD, so I run in the Democratic primary, and I have a commitment to working with Democrats, because to me, a political party is a tool. It's a means to get to an end. It's not the end in of itself. And if I could have my way, we would just dismantle political parties, and like we would just have sort of like this anarchistic political system. But that being said, we don't. So the Progressive Party on the state level, like 80% of the time, we're like hand in hand with the Democrats, and like we're pushing for the same things. But there's areas where we really do differ, and I can give you one quick example, which is involving the pensions of state workers and teachers. So like behind the scenes, the Democratic leadership created a plan where they were going to charge the workers more and make them work longer to get less. And they brought this bill out to the Government Operations Committee and was like, here's our proposal, without really consulting the workers or even all the legislators. It was kind of done behind closed doors by the Democratic leadership. And I'm the co-chair of the Working Vermonters Caucus, which is like the labor and workers' rights caucus. And there's a progressive and a Democrat who are leaders of that, because it's a place where we intersect strongly in the pro-labor Democrats and the progressives who are all pro-labor. So that's a big difference, because we all are, not just a piece of us. In that caucus, even though, the unions were asking us to fight back, and we did. Like we offered an amendment to create an income tax surcharge on income over 500 grand to help pay off our obligations. And like the Democratic leadership viciously fought us, and like only 21 people, 7 progressives and 14 others, one of which was a Republican, voted for that. So that means like 100 and something Democrats, or whatever, like 90 something Democrats maybe it was like 80 something Democrats. I'd have to do the math. Don't quote me on the numbers. But the point is, the vast majority of the Democratic caucus voted against labor and against a tax on wealthy people that like top 1% of Vermonters, because they didn't feel like that was the right process. So then the next week, we came to them with a counter proposal to create a task force, and Democratic leadership, actually, they listened to us, which was wonderful. And they scrapped the original proposal, adopted that plan, but then stacked it so there's more state officials than workers on this task force. So it creates the conditions where, for the workers, it feels like, okay, you're just putting us on a group where we're outnumbered. And we really pushed hard to try to have equal partnership on that group, and it wasn't accepted. So I had to vote no on the bill, and like I think 10 of us voted no on that bill, like 7 progressives and 3 Democrats. And so my point is, on that issue, there was a massive divide between the loyalty of the progressives to labor and Democrats. But that's unusual. most of the time we work really closely together, and I view the Democrats as my partners. I even view the Republicans as my partners in the end. Political parties are one affiliation we have, and we really need to look past that and see each other as humans.
I think it's an interesting, Vermont is unusual in the sense that, and I'll totally agree, we have a bunch of Democrats who, in my opinion, are Republicans. I always say, I wish we could stop, freeze, regroup, give ourselves different names and start over, because we effectively don't have much of a Republican Party in Vermont. But it's interesting, if you go back in history, there was, in the early days of the Burlington City Council, there was often alliances between the progressives and the Republicans because of sort of issues around wanting to get things done, and sort of a, there is an old style for, and I'm way older than all of you, a Vermont Republican that had a different, let's treat people well kind of thing, even though not as political. And so this is sort of an interesting history there.
Yeah, I added something in the chat because I don't want to interrupt you, but the Republicans actually had complete control of all branches of state government for decades, like 80 years or something. There's this big chunk of Republicans, and then the Democrats kind of came back and started taking over, and then the progressives came in. But if you look at Vermont history, there's been many political parties in Vermont. Like, people will sometimes say, oh, why do we need 3? But if you look back at our origins, there were many. So Vermont has a really interesting history when it comes to political parties.
Awesome.
That's a whole thesis for one of you people to do.
I love the discourse. The back and forth was really awesome. So I wanna get to the environment. We have 15 minutes left until 6. We wanted to spend the last half hour on the Q&A, but I think it might be good if we spend this next 15 minutes on the environment, then do a targeted Q&A focused on how to get UVM students involved, and then go back to general questions until 6:30. So I'm going to start for the next 15 minutes on the environment. First, I want to ask Alex a question. So you talked a little bit at the beginning about the different ways that or Old North End Mutual Aid gives direct aid to people struggling during the pandemic, and how it plays an active role in demonstrations and protests, from social issues to economic and environmental justice issues. So you kind of mentioned at the beginning this idea of like moving ONEMA forward after the pandemic. So how do you see ONEMA moving forward into a just sustainability campaign?
Okay, I think that's a great question. So we have not personally as a group been involved with specific issue campaigns or specific political advocacy or activism at this point. But there's a very obvious tie-in to how we do come into this. And it's that this is our MO, that if there are people that are not getting what they need at a structural level, this is still something that concerns us as community members that we need to come together on. And so this is something that we have already kind of been involved in. We had some requests for support for the protests at Battery Park, and we were able to coordinate getting some things to them. And when we think about the movement for sustainability, I think it's important to think about what the movement's seeking to do and what would need to happen to reach those goals. And I think we can really look to the lessons of the last year of how to challenge what I would say are really entrenched structures of power. Obviously, all of these largely polluting companies don't want to have their bottom lines cut if they can help it. And so this is a really large structural force that has to be taken on. And this is kind of at the root of what we're doing as an organizing group with mutual aid, is that we're forming connections of community between people. And it's through these connections that the real kernel of organizing begins to kind of take shape. So a big part of our work is that we, are addressing a problem that hasn't been addressed yet, but that we think that there are a lot of people that wanted to be involved to try and fix it. And so the bridge between these two things is organizing. And that means that we're taking, the efforts of a smaller group of people, and each person then has the ability to talk with and coordinate with, a dozen, 25, however many people, to get people on the same page to do something, to get them to show up to do something, to kind of have a coordinated plan in mind. And so when we're building these connections, we're kind of just making this happen in a generalized way already. And so we already kind of have, some informal relationships with other groups that are doing activism work in the community. And I think what we can offer is really just a really strong model for how you can apply this kind of thinking and organizing to really any task of social justice, environmental justice that you could think of, where each of us is capable of a lot more work when we coordinate together, and when we have a focus on bringing people together to do something that we couldn't do on our own. Like I said, we've kind of already, with Old North End Mutual Aid, been leaning into some connections with other organizations in the area, like Food Not Bombs and Cop Watch, and they've done a collaboration project in the last year called Food Not Cops that's been doing things. We have some connections with Decolonize Burlington, and through those we've been able to significantly extend the reach of what we've been able to do. I can remember one specific thing. I'll try to keep details light just for privacy reasons, but we had a family that was facing homelessness really urgently, and we kind of got the alarm out to all of these groups we had connections with, and within 24 hours we raised thousands of dollars, figured out a place for them to be able to stay, so their whole family wasn't on the street for a night at all. And then we were able to follow up and figure out, longer term, how can we get people connected to bigger resources that, will help secure housing. And we were able to leverage the knowledge of this whole group. We have an email list of 300 people at this point. And it was amazing just how quickly everything happened when this call for help went out, because we had done this work of building all these connections. And so I think this is something that you can see translate really easily to other types of activist struggles. Build those connections, and do it with the intention that I know what needs to be done, and I know there are other people that want to do it with me, and we're just going to figure out how we actually make it happen. Yeah, my biggest advice here is to just lean into casting the biggest net possible, the widest net possible, for people that you can involve, because once you do that, then things just start happening, because you've got all this power of all these people behind you, and really then it just becomes automatic.
Awesome. So that's great. I want to move next to Brian. I have a question for you, because I think that it's a bit tangential to this question pertaining to your work in the state legislature. So you've co-sponsored a number of bills, as you mentioned earlier, that pertain to disparities in racial justice existing in our system. From Nick, these range from bills talking about disparities in our healthcare system to bills acknowledging eugenics in the Vermont state legislature that were enacted in surveys 100 years ago. How do these different how do the different disparities impact environmental issues? Do we see these same disparities impacting people of color as it pertains to the environment? And how does a just sustainability campaign move forward inclusively with people of color?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, because if we look at history, that if we go to the start of our country, indigenous people were forced off land, and their relationship with their land, their homelands, was severed, and people were relocated, or their villages were burned. Like, we could go on and on about what happened. So like, it was very environmental from the start, like that this was land that was inhabited by indigenous people who had a very different connection to land than the colonists, a different understanding of what land is and like our relationship to the land. And that was all thrown on its head by colonists who brought capitalism here. And land went from being like, land wasn't something we owned. Land was something we were part of. And like, the land has stories, and like the different features of the land have stories, and it's like alive. Whereas colonists look at land as like a commodity to be bought and sold and to accumulate, and then to use that to control people as landlords and etc. So I share all this because when we talk about environmental justice, from the very start of this country, there was environmental injustice by the way that the land was treated by the colonists. And it grew from there with the Industrial Revolution, and our whole economic system has been built on exploitation of labor of people and extraction from the planet. And so indigenous people have been at the center of that. Black people, Africans were brought here, and labor was exploited and extracted to build up this economy. And then once slavery ended, it transformed into other forms, and Black people found themselves living in places that were like environmental injustice zones. I think the best I could do is give you a specific example, but it's not a Vermont example. Where I grew up in New Jersey is a place with a lot of people from all over the world. So it's like every house on my street, people came from a different country or a different culture. And in my neighborhood growing up, some of my earliest memories are like the soil being dug up and put in trucks by people in like hazmat suits, because it was radioactive, because it was a Superfund site. And when I was a kid, a chemical plant exploded, and I remember birds like falling on me out of this like fiery cloud. Like, that doesn't happen to people everywhere. That a lot of the places where this is happening are places that are racially and socially diverse places. They're places where poor people live. And so I'm sharing that because when this economy was built to extract and exploit, the working people, the people like my grandparents who worked in mills in New Jersey, like in horrible, like as children, in these like horrible conditions, like that where the people lived and worked, they were mistreated, and that land was mistreated. And all of that wealth was extracted and sent to other places that were kept clean and nice and fresh and fancy. And so I share that because environmental justice is integrally intertwined with racial justice from the start of this country. And so when we're looking at our solutions now, they're integrated. I don't think we can really we can't really separate justice. And so when we look at like, I'll give you an example, like the BIPOC land access bill. So there's a bill that Seating Power introduced, and in which we want the state to invest in creating a board that's made up of people from impacted communities who give out money to people from impacted communities to buy land for individual ownership, for collective ownership, for agriculture, to create wealth management, financial education programs, and to fund mutual aid programs, so that it's not just about giving money to people, but it's actually about giving people power when they haven't had it, to then acquire land and become stewards of the land and restore that relationship for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color to the land that was severed by colonization. So that's one example, but like there's many other policies I could talk about. I just don't want to take up too much time. I would encourage people to look at what Renew Vermont is doing and the Thrive Agenda and this idea of environmental justice zones, because moving forward, maybe I should give one example of Vermont, because people might be like, oh, so Vermont's this paradise. Vermont is not the paradise everyone thinks. Like, many of you, if not all of you, probably live in the F-35 zone. So why is it that, you know, the blackest and brownest neighborhoods, the poorest neighborhoods of our state, are the ones being subjected to the F-35? You know, that's an example of an environmental injustice that we're experiencing right now. Another is the Southern Connector that is proposed to be built. It diverts traffic from the white parts of the South End into the brown parts of the South End. And it clearly does that. And so that's another example of like the way we design things sometimes, like people don't think about it, but when the people in power are allowing things to happen and those people in power are white and wealthy, then the way the infrastructure is built, it puts the burden, the environmental burden, on poor people, on Black and brown people, on people with disabilities, on queer people. I could go on, but like it's an issue that you know, it comes out in all our policies. So I'll just stop there and see what others have to say. Thank you.
That's fantastic. I actually have a segue question to give to Max and Sarah that relates directly to that. How is the Burlington City Council, what are some of the various ways that the Burlington City Council has tried to incorporate these themes of just sustainability into policy? I know that we've seen in some of the direct ballot initiatives, there have been attempts to, you know, like, and actually addressing what Brian had just brought up, there was a charter change to add Winooski reps to the Burlington Airport Board that was passed in a direct ballot initiative. So I'd just love to hear what your guys' thoughts are on how that's implemented in city policy.
I mean, we've had a number of just this batch of charter changes. We have the just cause eviction proposal, which I actually worked a lot on. We have the thermal energy proposal. I mean, and Max has much broader history than I do, but you know, I think one thing is you got to sort of pick away at it. Well, you know, we're trying a proposal to weatherize all rental housing is, you know, kind of on the docket. We've done minor things like ban gas-powered leaf blowers in favor of electric simply because they just waste the environment. So you know, the municipal level stuff is an interesting perspective. You know, what can you, I guess, for lack of a better word, control, and what do you have to work with other partners for? So I think there's a, you know, we have a really I think strong net zero energy policy within the city, and it's a lot of little things going, reducing, you know, parking requirements for new builds. And I think on the municipal level, you got to sort of pick away at it. Sometimes it's not as flashy, I guess, if you would say, as some of the federal stuff. We're spending a ton of money on trying to fix up the lake, but that's a big regional problem. Maybe, again, Max probably has more history on the specific regs.
Yeah, well, Sarah, I'm glad you referenced the housing stuff, because I think that's a real place of overlap, because one of the things that's gaining greater attention is just the tremendous disparities in Black homeownership. 18 houses, just 18 houses in the city of Burlington are Black owned. I mean, that's out of thousands of homes and thousands of housing units, 18 are Black owned. So when you deal with these issues of housing justice, whether it's just cause evictions, whether it's weatherizing units, you're because of the disproportionate numbers of people of color specifically renting, you do have that policy impact. I think in terms of the justice framework, though, there's a number of things. I'm glad that Brian raised both the F-35 issue as well as the Champlain Connector. I think those are two examples of where, you know, there's been an effort, at least in the context of the F-35, to address that from some, not necessarily a full buy-in from either the mayor or the congressional delegation. So I think that's been an area where there's been friction and not really, to my mind, necessarily a full recognition of the full scope of the impacts, in particular, the impacts on individuals of color in the community. I think with the Champlain Parkway, there's also sometimes with planning decisions, a kind of sort of inertia, for lack of a better word, that gets going, where a project like that, where it's been ongoing or potentially ready to be built, you know, the joke is always, it's always 2 years from being built, because there's always been delays. They've been trying to build this thing for 30 years. And there's an inertia that I think can sometimes prevent people from asking these crucial questions, like about these kinds of policy measures. And it's, I think, easy to fall prey to that, but I think we're increasingly having to ask ourselves these questions. And one example of that I've dealt with is and that I think has relevance when we talk about some of the transportation decisions is that some of the solutions we have to make sure that we're not making or creating other issues while potentially creating a solution. One example that comes to mind is that Amtrak service is going to be returning to Burlington likely within the next year. So you're going to be able to take a train from the waterfront to New York City, which is going to be incredible. But as a part of that, we had to figure out where we were going to store the train overnight. And there's a startup and cool down process that goes along with that. There's noise and pollution impacts, and a number of different sites were looked at. What was interesting in that process is that the site, one of the sites that was looked at was immediately below the Lakeview Terrace street, which is probably one of the most expensive streets and one of the whitest streets in Burlington. And you have that option of putting a train, storing the train there was I don't think ever really got considered. But people were a lot more comfortable thinking about putting it by Riverside Apartments, right, sort of by the power plant in the Old North End, which has a much larger concentration of people of color, and specifically New American populations. And so it seemed like, in trying to address this transportation need, there was a desire to make a sacrifice with that. And so it wasn't until we started actually challenging folks and engaging around that issue and raising that issue that we were able to actually get an option that the rail yard said wasn't ever possible to actually be possible, which was to just store the train in the rail yard in the first place. Somehow that became possible because of that push and that pushback that took place. And so I think it is really important to be bringing these kinds of questions into our sustainability decisions, because if we don't, we're just going to continue to make the really harmful decisions that have typified policy for, really the entirety of our country's history, really.
Well, it gets complicated. It gets sort of, I don't know, that analogy of, you push one place and out pops another. And that's the struggle, I think, particularly at municipal level politics, is you want to get something done, but you get frustrated about, how do you get it to be where you want it to be? And everybody's got an opinion on it.
Awesome. That's great. All right. Well, with that, we'll turn over to our last set of questions about how to better involve, how to get the UVM community more involved, and then we'll go to general Q&A.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. I think that the main question that I want to ask here about how UVM students can get involved is just what are some ways other than voting that UVM students can help progress their ideas and policies they support? And this can be open to anybody, really.
I would encourage everyone to consider getting involved in community service and mutual aid. For me, that's the thing that I did, that I've done the longest, that gave me the experiences that have helped me navigate the elected world and that policy world. I feel like I go into the belly of the beast when I have to go into that situation, and but knowing that I'm connected to the people gives me strength. So I would encourage people to start with that, to get involved with community service or mutual aid, or a policy group or an organization that resonates with you. Some of the ones I would recommend is the Democratic Socialists of America, which I'm a member of. We have an eco-socialist group, if anyone's interested in that we eco-socialist working group we just formed. If you're a capitalist, I can't help you that much. Maybe maybe you could reach out to the Burlington Business Association and try to help them understand the way that capitalism has exploited the earth, and maybe look at how businesses could be more eco-friendly. I don't know. But I guess what I'm saying is there's many organizations. You could get involved with the political parties. You could become part of the Progressive Party or the Democratic Party. You could even become part of the Burlington Republican Party. It does still exist. There's 5 people. So if a bunch of you joined, you could take it over. That's what happened in North Dakota in 19 2011 or something, like people took over the state Republican Party and like created the nonpartisan league and then created a state bank and almost seceded from the United States. And it all came from farmers taking over the Republican Party. So I mean, you could choose to go that route. You could be like, besides political organizations, there's also other advocacy organizations like the Peace and Justice Center you can get involved in, or the Workers Center. So I'm just putting this out there because I actually think you can influence policy through so many different angles besides the electoral angle. And I think that's important to recognize because people become intoxicated with the power of the colonial political system. And I think it's important to like remember that what's most important is our relationships to each other and not these systems of oppression that we're living in. So I would just say, go out, find a group that's doing something you're interested in and get involved. And if that group doesn't work for you, because that will happen, you'll go to groups and you'll be like, oh, like, you know, everyone here is a white middle-aged man. Like, they're not listening to me. That happens a lot. You know, it's like, all right, I'm going to a different meeting now. You know, I got to be honest, that happens a lot in like leftist circles in Burlington, you know, or maybe you go to another group and you're like, I feel like, you know, this group isn't doing enough. They just read books too much. I mean, like, but I would encourage you to explore, go out, explore our local organizations, explore the resources, volunteer for the People's Kitchen. You know, we're giving out food on May Day at the State House if you want to come down, and that would be a great event to come to because you can meet all the different unions and all these different, there's all going to be all different unions and community organizations present. But Burlington has a really rich social fabric and a history, a radical history going back 200 years. Like, if you really look at our history of being a place, the name Burlington is, the city was called Palatine. In Abenaki, it means the wrong way current, because before the breakwater was built, the way the waves went off the shore, it was really hard to land because the current flowed against the grain. But I like to claim that as like Palatine, it's like we're going against the grain here. The current here is flowing against the tide, like we're going against the oppression. So there's so many organizations to check out, and I would encourage you to do that.
I mean, this is not as radical as Brian, but we have, and I think, I don't know where you all come and where your hometowns are, but we have a very rich not-for-profit sector. And that's where you're going to meet the people. I mean, work in a housing co-op. There's a fabulous program that started out at UVM with UVM students mentoring children that lived in public housing. I mean, my background was at UVM working with elders and people with disabilities. That's how did I get into housing? I realized that a lot of these folks had nowhere to go, nowhere to be. We could have great food programs, but if they had nowhere to eat the food, they needed a roof. And so a lot of the systems connect. And I also encourage you, and this may be more capitalist, but learn about where the money comes from. If you can't build a house for somebody and give them food and educate them without understanding how that happens. I told one young intern I had, you might not like it, but follow the money, because that's how you get the services for the folks you want. And that's how you change the system. If you understand it to begin with, then you can work to change it. But right now you're at a point where you really just need to learn, what do the folks benefit from? How do you get it for them? How does it all work together? And there's always internships, I think, out there. And particularly look at the not-for-profit sector, because it's very robust in Burlington, and probably more so than perhaps some of your hometowns.
All right, I guess I'll chime in here. I think Brian kind of already shouted out our side of the world a little bit already, but I'm going to maybe go a bit further than him on this. I think there are a lot of really good organizations in town that already exist. I would go one further. If you see a problem in town, if you see something that is unfixed, that needs attention from people to solve it, and you don't see an organization that exists to do it, there's nothing that stops you from finding some people that agree with you on what needs to be done, working with them and finding others, and just expanding to make your own organization or your own group that's actually, getting involved with these things. I think it's very important that I do agree. It's incredibly important that we understand the struggle that's in front of us, the real struggle that's in front of us, and how it all functions in relation to all of the other institutions of our society. But I think the thing that paralyzes most people is just not feeling like they're able to do anything, or that they need permission to do something first. And I would encourage you to not wait for this. If you see something that needs to be done, you're able to do it. It just takes, a little bit of thinking first to appreciate what the problem is in front of you. And it takes the work of, making these connections with others that can help you. But beyond that, just do is the biggest thing I can say, because the thing I see the most with young people is that they're paralyzed from doing anything because it all seems like too much. And starting with something small is more than doing nothing. And I really think that that's the one thing that I hope other young people could take away from, getting involved in political advocacy and activism.
I'll also just say that I think that there's a real importance of showing up. I think we saw that in this last year. I don't think that the resolution to cut the police force by 30% and do all kinds of things in favor of criminal justice and racial justice reforms in Burlington and police transformation would have happened if we didn't have the largest public forum with over 700 people commenting in Burlington. That changed the dynamic. That changed the conversation. When we're dealing with entrenched systems of systemic racism, the status quo is so powerful, and it requires continual showing up, because what happens in these conversations all the time, is that people, privileged white people, don't even have to show up to have their voices heard. People will make arguments and assumptions on their own behalf and say, and even when people show up, they'll say to argue the point that we really need to transform police here and to raise all these important points, they'll still give equal weight to the people who don't show up, which is a whole frustrating dynamic in and of itself. But it points to the need to engage and to stay engaged. It's not good enough to just come once. You need to stay engaged over time. It's not good enough to just come to full council. You need to be paying attention to how these issues pass through committees, because that's where so much of the ability to influence things. Many times when things get back to the full council, it's, procedurally you can certainly change things. You can make amendments and things, but I think that a lot of times if you're really trying to shift the conversation, that getting involved at that committee level, we have subcommittees of the council, and engaging at that level can also be helpful. It's not the end all be all. I think that all the other things that the other folks who spoke before me mentioned are incredible and really valid, but I just think that that's something that's really important, because we really need people to continue to be fighting for these issues if we want to see these things to change, given how entrenched they are and how challenging that's been over the last year.
I agree with Max, but one small bit of advice is take the time to know who you're talking to. I mean, the people that understood that I had an interest in affordable housing, I listened more to them. The people that sent me a cut and paste email and sometimes, just left name of counselor blank, just didn't get to me. So I encourage you, and this is really more what Alex is saying, sometimes bringing it down a notch, figure out a target of 2 or 3 legislators or counselors, understand their backgrounds, understand what their interest is, and that'll be a lot more effective than sending me a cut and paste email. And don't be afraid to call people,
right.
Text.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. And and for public forums, don't come and just repeat a pre-prepared statement that someone else wrote. Put in the time. If you're gonna, to really think of something, speak from your heart, speak for yourself. And I think that it's important to do that. Sometimes when people just read the same thing over and over again, it has an impact, but not quite as much of an impact when some of the folks really speak from the heart and really just write their own authentic words themselves. So that's something that I've seen.
So I think we have about 10 minutes left. I don't know if anybody in the that's viewing this has any questions they want to ask a specific person or everyone. Hopefully we can try to get to one or two of them. If anybody has a question that they want to put in the chat, or even turn your camera and mic on and say out loud.
Quiet. Oh, there's a hand.
Hi there, my name's Annie. I just had a question for Brian specifically, but if anyone else had, extra comments they wanted to make on it, I would be super interested to hear it. But Brian, I remembered how you mentioned your sort of, if you had it your way, you'd have an anarchistic political system. And I was just curious about what your sort of dreams and aspirations would be for like your own personal vision of the future, because I'm really interested in like dreaming the big creative solution and then finding the little steps to get there. So I was just curious about yours.
I have some, earlier Sarah said she wasn't as radical after I went. I think what I say is going to be radical for some people, but I'm okay with that. So I actually think that we're heading towards a way of life on Earth that we cannot predict with the rise of artificial intelligence. And I have been involved in legislation. Vermont was the first state to pass legislation regarding artificial intelligence, and we created a task force, and now we're looking at additional action. But I bring that up. It might seem like it's out in left field, but it's not, especially when you think about environmental justice and like what would happen if humanity merged with machines and really just lost our connection with nature, and like the earth just became something to just mine and turn into machines. But I actually think that's like the apocalyptic kind of like outcome. I think what's more likely going to happen is we're starting to get like, I'm in touch with policymakers in Europe. I was part of a fellowship over the summer. There's international AI policy that's pushing towards ethical AI. So I think inevitably the government is going to be running a way that we can't even imagine right now, because when humans are linked to machines, like with circuits in us, like when we become cyborgs, because it's not that far off, it's just going to change how we make decisions. Like we're not going to have to do the same processes, because we'll be able to make instant decisions by connecting with each other with our minds. So I know that might sound really far-fetched, and maybe that's like 50 years away, maybe sooner. So I think between now and there, what I would see is, what I'd like to see is us change the way that we make decisions as a society by shifting power out, decentralizing power. And so one idea is the creation of regional people's assemblies. We do have a bill that's in that would implement regional people's assemblies to create regional plans to transition Vermont, to create a just transition from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy over the next 20 to 30 years. And so, but that process of creating people's assemblies where the state is checking in with people on the regional level every year on the implementation of a plan to change the economy would actually create a new system of democracy, where on the regional level, people could get involved in people's assemblies and have more influence over how the money is spent in their regions. So that's one example of how we could like change the system of government. So building systems outside of the existing systems that decentralize power. Another example is Burlington has neighborhood planning assemblies. I would like to see the neighborhood planning assemblies be given more power over decisions and more power over how they spend money. So those are some examples of I think in the short term, in summary, I would say implementation of people's assemblies, neighborhood planning assemblies, more opportunities for people on the hyper-local level. Maybe we even break it down in Burlington to like blocks, like what we do with Is Good, where like each block or every few areas of blocks are meeting and creating mutual aid. So like when your neighbor's loud, there's someone you call who's on call in your neighborhood who helps you, and you don't call the police because there's like someone on your lawn. Like, I don't get that, like the people who call the cops because someone like touched something, like we could be helping each other. So I guess what I'm getting at is I see like us shifting the power to the local level. That would be like a powerful thing, like building these new systems or investing in existing systems like the MPA. And that would hopefully get us to help us transition to a regenerative economy where it's not just about respecting our relationship to the earth, but to each other as humans. And then as that's happening, and AI escalates and we start to merge with machines, I think that the outcome would be more positive. It'd be like socialist AI instead of capitalist AI. So I know that's going a little out there, but you asked like what you said dream. And I think it's like, if I had to think the next 50 years, I think we're going to see all these cool new systems, like where we transform how we relate, and technology is going to be part of that. And then like the technology is going to jump like in ways we can't even imagine. And we're going to be like, oh, we can figure everything out in like a second because we're connected to each other in a different way. Like, I think that stuff like that's going to start happening. And so who knows what is going to happen then? We just need to make sure that we have the power. Because if we continue to let them have the power, like they do right now with the AI we're using on these devices, they're gonna own us. Sorry to be negative, but we're like at a crossroads. So I'll stop there. I know we're running out of time. Next.
Thanks so much. That was really interesting.
I have a question that I can ask in the meantime, if nobody has a direct question in the chat. One thing that I've been wondering recently, so one of the direct ballot initiatives that came out of the election was the ranked choice voting initiative. And I know that Burlington, or my comparative politics teacher told us, our class, that Burlington formerly had a ranked choice voting system. So I was wondering, like, why did Burlington revert out of ranked choice, and like, why is Burlington going back to ranked choice now?
I think Burlington.
Long answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Burlington went out of ranked choice because there was that issue that Karen referenced at the beginning of this, having to do with Burlington Telecom. There was real frustration with the mayor at the time, Bob Kiss, and he won. The system worked fine. It worked as it was supposed to work, but he got elected because the way that ranked choice works, if you don't know, is that you have to get a majority of votes, and so it went to several rounds before you could get a majority, and so nobody got over 50% in the first round. But he wasn't the top vote getter in the first round, and so people sort of said, "Well, oh, because that was the case, that the system didn't work," or something to that effect, and also frustration around that. Then so that led to this desire to get rid of it in some senses, and then when that was ongoing, they had a really good, the people who were trying to get rid of it had a really clear message. They said, "Keep voting simple." That's what all the signs said: "Keep voting simple," and so. And then there wasn't really an effective campaign to counter it. So that's what got rid of it. I think what we're continuing to see, though, is that, when we continue to have is a system where, you can elect people with less than 50% and you could get less than 40%, or you could get just over 40% and still win an election. And that puts you in a really challenging position as an elected official.
I mean, it's complex. I think there's an argument which is too nerdy for me to articulate, that the particular methodology. I mean, there's always this off chance that with 4 top candidates, the math works differently. I have a constituent who's a strong supporter of IRV, but not the particular method we have, which I can't articulate. So that's involved in the conversation. I think if you look at where IRV is used the most, it's in communities with nonpartisan elections and a lot of at-large elections, which is something I personally think we also need to have a conversation about. Should we have more at-large elections and more move to nonpartisan? For instance, our school board in Burlington is nonpartisan. You don't declare a party. And actually, Burlington and I believe Rutland are the only 2 communities where your city councilors and your mayor have a party. So I think there's a lot of, Max is right. There was history behind the particular withdrawal, and it's, I think, very specific.
Fantastic. Well, thank you guys. Thank you for an amazing, being an amazing panel, for answering all of our questions today, and helping to inform all these students that showed up. We had a great showing. I'm so happy about the turnout. So cool. That's it. I will post the recording in the chat of this, and we'll figure out a way to get that out. But okay. Other than that, we're all set. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Keep in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Feel
Thank
free
you.
to reach out to
Thank
any
you so
questions.
much.
Yeah.